All right, the topic of this video is imaginary solutions. We know what to expect if we get a square root with a positive number in it. We were looking for the number which times itself equals the number on the inside. So with square root of 9, we know it's 3. But what about square root of negative 9? What would we do with that? Well, the definition of an imaginary number is that the square root of negative 1 equals I. Mathematicians created this to take the place of the negative number inside the square root, which was preventing them from answering the question. If they can put an I in place of the negative part of the square root, then they can keep working with their problem. And later on, maybe the imaginary numbers will combine, or maybe they'll cancel out, and they can keep working their problem for longer and longer. For us, it's going to show up in our final step when we're solving. So we just have to figure out how to find that negative 1 and how to apply it. So if we see something like a square root of negative 9, we want to think of that as a positive 9 multiplied by a negative 1. Because then we can do what we always do with square root of 9, and we can discover that square root of negative 1, which is equal to I. So here we go. The square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of negative 1 is I. So the answer that we're going to learn to write for square root of negative 9 would be 3I. Okay, let's try again. What if we had negative 36 in our square root? So we think of that as a square root of a positive 36 and a negative 1. So we can think of square root of 36 times square root of negative 1. And we know the square root of 36, that's a perfect square. We'd have 6I. Okay, so what about square root of negative 12? Well, that would be 12 times negative 1. The square root of 12 is not a pretty number. We'd have to get a decimal for that. And we don't really want a decimal because these are going to be at the end of our problems. We're going to leave any non-perfect square inside the square root and just replace that square root of negative 1 with our imaginary number, I. Now, just for the record, when you have a square root and an imaginary number, it's customary to put the imaginary number first and the square root second. Okay, so let's solve how we know how to solve and see the negative square root show up along the way. So find x when y is negative 9. We'll have to make our substitution of negative 9. And since we have one x value here, we're going to solve by undoing. So we're going to take our order of operations and reverse them. So first we'll be adding 5. So negative 4 equals 3 times x plus 5 squared. And then we'll be multiplying or dividing. So in this case, dividing by 3. We can leave this fraction here, or we can make it a decimal. I know many people are more comfortable saying negative 1.3 repeating than writing a fraction, so we'll go with that. Now we're to the e for PEMDAS, so we're undoing our exponent. We're undoing squaring with square root. And it's important to remember two things. Every time we square root, we put a plus or minus in front of it. And of course, we just got a negative in our square root. So we're not going to be able to use our calculator here. We're going to finish with our new imaginary number. So go ahead and clear away the 5 by subtracting 5, and let's get the answer formatted. We'll have x equals negative 5 plus or minus the square root of negative 1.3, repeating. Well, we know that if we have a negative inside of our square root, we're going to need an imaginary number. So we're going to think of that as the 1.3 repeating times a negative 1. Of course, we still have the negative 5 plus or minus here in front. So that negative 1 inside the square root is where the I enters the picture. So x equals negative 5 plus or minus I square root 1.3 repeating. There's no reason in us getting a decimal for the 1.3 repeating in the square root because the 5 is not an imaginary number and the square root of 1.3i is an imaginary number, so they're not like terms. We wouldn't combine them, so we can leave it like that. So make sure every time you have a negative in your square root, you use an imaginary number and I in its place.